You're watching a special program of World Insight, 16th anniversary of September 11th. What were the hard lessons of history learned since September 11th attacks? We are joined by three panelists from different parts of the world. In Beijing studio, Yang Mingjie, a research fellow at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, is one of the leading Chinese experts on campaign against terrorism. Mr. Yang, welcome to our program.
Hello.
Meanwhile, joined us from Washington, D.C. in the U.S., Michael O'Hanlon, also one of the leading names in his country on the issue of anti-terrorism, Director of the Research for Foreign Policy at the Brookings Institution. Mr. O'Hanlon, great to have you. And also in Nairobi, Africa, we are joined by Mwenda Mbijiwe, who is the CEO of the Eye on Security and former Kenya Air Force officer. Welcome, sir. I want to welcome the three of you, gentlemen, for the fact that 16 years have passed, yet a lot of things are still haunting us these days. I want to go to you first, Mr. O'Hanlon. There are several questions I really need to ask you. One is about whether America is as united as it used to be after September 11th. Now, when you look at the realities now, what does it mean for America's efforts against the terrorism?
Well, greetings. And no, we are not as united now as we were 16 years ago, although, of course, the reasons are very complex, and they're not necessarily mostly about terrorism. Clearly, the election of Donald Trump last year and the strong showing even of Senator Bernie Sanders reflected a deep unease in the country. And it's not primarily, in my opinion, about foreign policy. I believe it's more about our own internal well-being as a nation and our economy above and beyond anything else. And in your package earlier, your reporter very ably talked about the concerns about Islamic extremism and terrorism, but also the Dreamers and the border wall. I think these are largely separate issues, but where they come together and where the Dreamer and border wall issues really reinforce the problem is on the economy. Americans are unhappy about how their lives are going in middle America, and that's why there was so much anger that propelled Donald Trump to the presidency. It was not primarily a reaction to 9/11. It was, to some extent, in relation to ISIS and to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and the general sense of being bogged down. But it was as much as anything about our internal cohesion and our economy.
Mr. O'Hanlon, of course, one of the important issues is what the President Trump did talk about. Half an hour ago, he just made his speech in front of the Pentagon. And actually, he didn't touch much at all about the U.S. campaign against terrorism globally, not even on the home turf. He rather was sending a warning to those who, he said, quote, try to intimidate the United States of America. It seems that there has not been that clear messages coming from the head of state in your country on this very important day. To you, what does that mean?
Well, you know, September 11th is a sad day, as you know, and I appreciate your support and your sympathies from Beijing and around the world with your viewership. This is really a day that we mark and remember those who lost their lives. It is not really a day that's frequently used for big policy debates about what to going forward. As you say, those questions are always on our mind. But on the morning of September 11th, we really turn to remembering. That's where most of us have been. I was at my child's school this morning, and we said a prayer for the families who lost people. That's the way we think about September 11th for most of us. And we don't expect President Trump to give a big policy speech when he's commemorating the tragic losses of that day 16 years ago.
Right. Having said so, though, Mr. Yang, here in Beijing, we see the earlier two presidents, President Bush and President Obama, both made commemoration speeches with very specific content about how the war against terror should be fought here at home and also abroad. How do you see that comparison, Mr. Yang?
For me, I think the first question about how divided of the United States, I think it's divided not on the community level, it's on the high political level, which means that President Bush, there are some difference between the opinions on the war against Afghanistan and Iraq. There's some debate and dividing in the United States. But in Trump's administration, I think the high politics levels divided by the opinions on the values of immigration. That means what Mr. O'Halloran said is can be regarded as a basement for the founding of the United States as immigration, but now they have so different opinions. For me, I think the homeland security has become broad issues, not only for Americans, but maybe related to some countries.
From war against terrorism after September 11th to the two wars in Afghanistan and then in Iraq, one is pretty much supported by the international community. The other is not at all authorized by the international support. We see a chain of global so-called regime change in the Middle East. Mr. Yang, we all understand the impact of that, even for our world today.
For that, I think it can be regarded a very bad thing for the world because of the second war as Iraq war. Not only, I think, two wars, but another is the Syria civil war. It's related not to regime change, but also related to the so-called proliferation of the values, the Western values, the American values, that make a trouble for the local countries and the local regions. It makes some proliferation of the terrorism and the radicalism in these regions.
We're going to have our American guests respond to that later in our discussion. But for now, let's go to our African panelist, Mr. Mwenda Mbijiwe. It was such a pleasure to have you. I understand in Africa, after September 11th, years after that, Boko Haram has become such a big issue in your part of the world. There are efforts being made. What is the latest situation according to your assessment? When it comes to global cooperation of terrorism, what role can Africa play?
Thank you very much. Indeed, today is a sad day when we remember what happened, 16 years ago in America. But in Africa, terrorism, especially as you mentioned, the three major groups of terror that have been operating in this region, Al-Shabaab in East Africa, Boko Haram, majorly in Nigeria, and then of course there is the new Islamic or Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, which is called Akim. Terrorism in Africa has become, part of the global network, and indeed, you can tell it is a big problem in Africa by the viciousness of the attacks that these groups have mounted in Africa. Of course, we all sadly know about the Chibok girls in Nigeria, where Boko Haram took these girls, and very few of them have been found since they were taken captive. Today in Kenya, we talk about Westgate attack, we talk about the University of Garissa attack, where many people died. Just the other day in Mali, terrorists attacked a hotel. So yes, terrorism is still a big part of Africa's security problems. In Africa, we are trying to advise our government on how to deal with this problem. We are cooperating with partners, in Europe, in America, in China, on how to equip our forces in Africa to combat these problems.
After September 11th, we see globally there are groups and also organizations, platforms being created to go against the terrorism, but whether they are functioning to the efficiency that we want them to be, and whether changes in the world to provide fertile surface in a way for terrorism to grow vis-a-vis the efforts people are making against terrorism are going to be in a way balanced. This is a big question. Mr. O'Halloran, your thought here.
Well, you're right to, first of all, have our friend from Nairobi speak about the great challenges there. And I think you're right, we have to balance different concerns and bear in mind the way terrorism affects so many people in the broader Middle East and Africa. This is where it's been the most serious. I don't think we necessarily need to balance any tolerance for terrorism. I know you were not implying that. I think we need a concentrated, collaborative strategy to address it in the near term in security terms, but in the long term in terms of the roots of terrorism. And that relates to the economic problems, not just in the United States, but even more in the Arab world, in the Sahel, in parts of the world where there is such a frustration that people look for extreme answers and extremist groups to channel their anger. And so this is an ongoing concern, and it's one of the reasons why I think the Arab Spring failed, because the Arab Spring was trying to address a problem. It didn't have very many good solutions. The degree of anger and frustration is so palpable, and it's really a long-term problem that's going to keep terrorism going unless we can address it.
Mr. Mbijiwe, what do you think the root cause? What are the root causes to you, for example, when you're thinking about the question from Africa's perspective?
Well, if you look at some of the key issues that have made terrorism find its roots in Africa, you want to look at the socioeconomic problems, for example. There is ravaging poverty across Africa. There is huge youth unemployment. You know, a large part of Africa's youth is still unemployed, and a lot of African governments are not doing enough to get these young men employed. So those people recruiting, we call them radicalizing them, you know, find easy fodder in these young men to convert them to terrorists. And recently, of course, there was the big problem of large African youths, you know, traveling to Syria and joining ISIS. So these issues are still in the society, societal, you know, issues that affect the bedrock of our society. And until African governments begin to invest in it, in their society, in their people, you know, build infrastructures that are able to support our people in Africa, so that people do not have to see terrorism as a way to come out of poverty, as a way to meet their daily needs, so that young men in Africa do not, you know, board boats, you know, across the Mediterranean, risk their lives, so that they are running to go look for a life somewhere else. We need in Africa to wake up. African governments need to invest in checks and balances that help our people to grow in Africa and have a means of livelihood in Africa. And of course, we need to invest immensely in intelligence and security infrastructure in Africa, so that, you know, even as these radicalizers come after our youth, after our people, then we are able to identify them, pick them, and prosecute them.
All right, Mr. Yang, final words from you for the very first half of our discussion. You know, we talked about this 15 years ago, 10 years ago, 5 years ago, and it seems that we're still talking about it, talking about all the list of to-do still today. What does that mean, Mr. Yang? Have we done better? Are we doing things? Are we really tackling the problems? Mr. Yang.
I think that we have to do some process in the campaign of terrorism in the global level, but we have to admit that we lack of the consensus, global consensus on counterterrorism issues. Also, we lack of the consensus not only by consensus itself, but also by the standards, how to give categories of terrorism. So for the future, I think we need a comprehensive campaign against terrorism. The comprehensive means not only by military, by law enforcement means, but also by economic development and social cooperation in the world, so that we need a one standard policy, not a double standard policy.